Hi everyone, and welcome back to Coachy TV. In this video, we'll look back at specific prep important workouts, or we really call these more quite important workouts for the specific prep phase of the cross-country season. And we're looking at both intensive tempo and special endurance 1. Typically during the track season, and I just did a video also on anaerobic paces that I'll put in the description down below, you would treat these as different things, but I think for cross-country, there's a way that these two kind of can cross over in the same way that intensive tempo can cross over with special endurance 2 workouts, which I will do a subsequent video on here in the next couple days. What we're looking at here with intensive tempo and special endurance 1, we'll be looking at is how do these two workout types, and I'll abbreviate these as capital IT and SE1 instead of writing it out the whole time. How do these two workout types enhance performance in the cross-country 5K? And how should these workout types be modified for the cross-country season? If you did watch the workout video, or the video talking about anaerobic pace summaries, you'll see that that's really geared towards more track in terms of the way they're traditionally done. And I mentioned in that a little bit the variant that can happen with cross-country in terms of, do you need to do things like 400-meter testing and how you can set up workout targets and things like that. And I think it really should be adjusted for the cross-country season. I'll walk you through what I've done, and you can kind of figure out what works for you in your situation. So the picture here is from our 2019 track team during a special endurance 1 workout type. So you will see that this is one that they're going to be doing on the track quite fast. You can see they separate out pretty quickly. This was the first turn at the start-finish line was just before this turn started here at Wharton High School. And you'll see here they're actually going to be spiked up, and we'll talk about why that's really important for special endurance 1 and intensive tempo, and then special endurance 1, and it'll kind of go in that order. I am Kyle Giacono, the head boys cross-country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida, and I have been for the last 7 years. If you'd like a closer look at my description or some of my credentials, they are on the screen. Okay, so we talked about this specific prep just to talk a little bit about the 5 parts of any macrocycle. Any macrocycle should start off with a transitionary phase, which is focusing on rest and recovery. It's where there's no training going on or any structured training. People shouldn't be bedridden during this time. You're dealing with people who are fairly active, but there's never a day of, go out and run 45 minutes at aerobic threshold or, 20 to 25 minutes at lactic. That's not going on in the transitionary phase. It's to get ready for rest and recovery. So that is, say you're done with your track season and most of the world is getting ready for cross country now. It's that 2 to 4 week period in between. Then you go into general preparation phase, which is what most of the world is also in currently right now. I am currently filming this on July 11th. So most of the world is right in the middle of their summer training for cross country. That's the general preparation phase. And the key there is you're just basically preparing for more intense work going forward. As you get into specific prep, probably in the August time frame, most people will be getting into that. What you're really looking at is specific preparation phase. You're looking at specifically preparing for the demands of the race. So kind of makes sense with the name here. So in general prep, we did a whole video series on this. It was really looking at the aerobic system and the specific strength that you can do during the summer. This is about half the training year. Specific prep, you're just getting ready for some of these demands, specifically things like acid development and getting ready for everything that gets you ready for the race, because you're not really doing anything that's getting you ready for acid development in general prep because of the way the anaerobic glycolytic system peaks at a different rate than the aerobic system, which is what you're dealing with here, as well as the alactic energy system, which never really truly goes through a peak. So this is the time frame we're dealing with. It looks like it's right in the middle, but really half the training year is spent in general prep. So it's probably getting more like 2/3 of the way done, something like that, as you're in specific prep. And then it'll get into pre-competitive, which is preparing for the most important meets. This is where the hardest training of the year happens. And the competitive phase, about the last 3, maybe 4 weeks of the season, depending. This is where the races basically dictate everything that you're doing. So just as an idea, that's where we are, kind of right in the middle, if you look at it this way. But it's probably a little bit more like slightly more than halfway through. You've done a ton of great aerobic work in general prep and specific strength. And now we're adding the last piece of the puzzle so you can specifically prepare for the demands, all the demands of the race.
So if we look at the different workouts that you're looking at here doing in the specific preparation phase, we're still dealing with, and this is should look familiar for those of you that looked at the whole general preparation phase series. And if you didn't watch those videos first, I definitely would look at those, even though we're about halfway through probably general prep, to make sure that you understand these. These are the things that we dealt with throughout the summer training, the critical workouts. where you have the long run, the VO2 max run, including VO2 max testing and recovery runs. These workouts are critically important for success in developing the key factors needed for success in the cross-country 5K. They focus on improving VO2 max, both the central and the peripheral VO2 max. The important workouts that we did throughout the summer also, we've got alactic runs, which is specific strength, as well as hill runs. We talk about short hill intervals, and then at the end of it, you transition to some medium hill runs. Again, this is also specific strength. And then tempo runs, lactic threshold runs. These are important, not as important as critical, but they are important because otherwise you wouldn't be doing them. These workouts are still very important to cross-country 5K success, but less so than the critical workouts. They focus mainly on running economy and specific strength, which is, again, it's important for cross-country, but as we'll look at in a couple slides here, VO2 max, both the central and the peripheral, are the key factors for who wins and who loses the cross-country 5K, or actually any 5K that distance. And then we've got quite important, these are the ones that in the general preparation video I said were not important during general prep, but here in specific prep, they become quite important because I'd say they're as important as these ones here, but they haven't been touched on, so we probably want to increase that maybe to slightly more important than these ones, only because you've been doing these for the previous, 8, 10, 11 weeks, something like that, whereas these ones you haven't done, and now you have to start the peaking window on those. And we're looking at intensive tempo and Special Endurance 1. In later videos, we'll look at Special Endurance 2. And we already did a video on extensive tempo. It'll be in the description down below. That's what starts the timing on some of the things that we're continuing to develop here with intensive tempo, Special 1, and also Special 2. These workouts cause improvements in the anaerobic glycolytic system, exposing the body to acid. That is basically most of what these things do. It's exposing your body to different relative levels of acid, starting pretty mild with extensive tempo, getting more intense, and then Special 1 and Special 2 have a lot of acid to get you used to it. That's basically what you're doing with this type of training so that you can fight through, delay the fatigue that comes with acid accumulation in the body. They focus on creating adaptations to buffer this acid, reducing or delaying fatigue, similar to what I just said here. So that's the idea of all of these quite important workouts with specific prep, and we'll see why these two really should be highlighted sort of together because it's a progression with these starting in specific prep. All right, so as I mentioned, the race metrics for the 5K, you have to know what makes up the race to understand how to create coherent workouts to create success in it. So the study that was first done in 2008 and has been subsequently kind of bared out by various studies afterwards. The primary author is Ingham, and they looked at a bunch of different races. They looked at basically the 800 out to the 10K, and they were trying to figure out who won and lost the races. What was the single biggest reason somebody won or lost the race, or was there maybe a covariance? And in the 5K, it was very clear. The single biggest predictor of who won was who had the best VO2 max, the most developed from all aspects of it, aerobic system, both central and peripheral. Can you move oxygen from your heart outward with different mechanisms, and can the working muscles use it? And who could use the most oxygen, VO2 max, at this race pace? So basically, who could run fastest aerobically, which makes a lot of sense considering the length of this race. 94.3%, that's as almost a sure thing as you can get in racing. From the USATF distance coaching curriculum, we will find that the 5K is run very close to VO2 max pace, or VVO2 max, or the velocity at which the body reaches VO2 max, 97% of it. So one of the best tests for VO2 max is run 2 miles as fast as you can, so it makes sense that the 5K is run a little bit slower than you're going to run your 2 mile, because it's a little bit longer, but it's pretty close. Hence the very close association between VO2 max pace and it causing, or being a big determining factor in who wins the 5K. And this race energy supply share study that was released by Dr. Matter and Dr. Hartman in 2018, they worked closely with the IAAF. They found that in the 5K, 4% of the energy came from the ATP that was just sitting in the muscles when they started the race, and then the phosphocreatine recharging ATP that's collectively called the alactic energy system. It does not produce acid. We were working on this throughout general prep. That's the specific strength, hills and fly 30s. You've got the aerobic system contributing 86% of the energy. That makes perfect sense because of the length of the race. And this is at race pace, because if you went and you walked a 5K, it'd be like 99% aerobic. There would still be some of these other energy systems providing energy, but you're not going to get success, obviously, walking it. So this is at race pace. And then what we're looking at here, starting in specific prep, is this 10% of the energy that comes from the anaerobic glycolytic system. This is basically where it becomes race pace. Anything above lactic threshold, and you have a significant contribution from the anaerobic glycolytic system. The downfall of this energy system is it does accumulate acid at higher intensities, which is what we need for success in this race. VO2 max pace, or aerobic power is what it really is specifically called. You're going to have an accumulation of acid. Anything that's over lactic threshold, and your body's going to accumulate the acid, and eventually you're going to stop either the workout or the race because of this. But we have to get the ability to delay that fatigue, as well as getting this energy system to produce that 10% of the energy that we need. So we don't want to throw away 10%, obviously. I mean, that, even if you were perfect on the alactic and perfect on the aerobic, you're only getting a 90%. We want to bump that up to see how we can get this person, either yourself or the person you're training or the team you're training, as good as they can possibly be. So that's where the focus is for here, which was not the focus during general prep. But in specific prep, which again, probably sometime in August timeframe, about mid-August, that's when you're going to be looking at this. The law of training specificity, something always very important to consider. Basically, it says that every training session has a specific effect on the athlete. You do workout A, result A, or adaptation A is going to happen in the athlete, right, based on that workout. You do workout B, and then adaptation B is going to happen in the athlete. If you do workout A, adaptation B is not going to happen because the body only adapts to what you're getting. That's the idea of specificity in training. But here's the key aspect. Whatever that training session is that's creating the effect on the athlete, great, which may or may not be desired for the event. It could be a fantastic workout for the 400, but if it's not going to help for success in the 5K, that training session may make you worse off. So that's something to always kind of consider. Just because you're training doesn't mean you're making yourself better. You have to understand the metrics of the race and understand that training specificity, you're only going to get better in these different areas if you create training for it. And if we're trying to get the anaerobic glycolytic system, which what we're looking at here, how will intensive tempo and special endurance 1 improve anaerobic glycolytic fitness, and will this negatively impact aerobic fitness? That's what we have to consider, because we need to get this better. We ignored it for the first half of the training year, but now we have to kind of get after it because it is 10% of the energy. But if we do too much of it, is it going to hurt this 86%? We can't overdevelop 10% to sacrifice 86% also. So there's kind of a balance there that we want to work in, and that's kind of an important thing that we're going to need to look at here as we go further. So to give you an idea of where these fit in, this is our energy system continuum based on percentage of VO2 max pace, just as sort of an indicator. This is from USATF distance curriculum. Otherwise, if it was just from the sprint curriculum, I haven't sat through those sprint courses myself, but my guess is they don't have a lot of these aerobic paces on there. So this is based on VO2 max, because a lot of coaches know where that is. Basically, it's 2-mile pace. 5K is a little bit slower, as we already talked about. Things like the mile pace and 800-meter pace are going to be obviously faster than 2-mile pace. So where do these actually fit in? So the way to kind of look at this chart, because I know there's a lot going on here, this is sort of the center point, VO2 max right here. Fastest aerobic pace is at 100%. As we said, the 5K is at 97%. If you did a 10K, it'd be 92%. The 1,500 meters is typically between 112 and 110%, depending on the fitness of the person, the aerobic fitness of the person. So that's how you can kind of read this as you are looking at it. So where do these actually fit in? Well, intensive tempo is right here. Very similar to mile pace for the most part. As you can see, it can go all the way out very close to special endurance 2 that we're going to be dealing with in other videos. But this is typically where you're going to want this to be. And then you'll kind of get closer to the other ones as you make some changes to the workouts. So intensive tempo is medium anaerobic glycolytic work with moderate acid accumulation. As I mentioned, you're thinking mile pace here. The video I did on extensive tempo, it really is your aerobic power VO2 max plus. I recommended in that video you be basically VO2 max minus 4 seconds per 400 if you're dealing with 400-meter intervals. That's the kind of pace you're dealing with, so it's out here. So this is basically just that next step up. If an extensive tempo is 70 to 80% best effort, intensive tempo is 80 to 90%. So it's going to hurt a little bit more. It's a little bit faster, but it's still more in the medium anaerobic work type. But obviously when you run the mile, you can definitely feel the acid at the end. So again, think mile pace as you're doing this. Now with Special Endurance 1, we're going to skip over Special Endurance 2 for this video, it's a little bit faster. This is, because it's from the distance curriculum, it's not on here, but this is essentially 400 meter pace, okay? So 130% VO2 max, and it's, you know, getting closer, it's 90 to 100% best effort, 100% would be alactic, so we're dealing with pretty fast when we get out to Special Endurance 1. Special Endurance 1 is very hard anaerobic glycolytic work, causing lots of acid to accumulate. As I said, think 400 meter pace. So the idea is we're going to start with intensive tempo in specific prep, and then we're going to be working our way out to Special Endurance 1. We're not going to get to the fastest Special Endurance 1 until later on in the year, the pre-comp type phase, but I want to kind of show how you can kind of get to that point in specific prep itself. So we mentioned acid, so let's talk a little bit about it. Acid accumulation in workouts. This is what lactic acid looked like if you ever wondered. Any workout intensity done above lactic threshold, I already mentioned this a little bit earlier, which is about 80% VVO2 max, about 85% 2 mile pace, has the potential to accumulate acid. Lactic threshold is the threshold at which lactic acid is being produced and cleared in unison. Anything above that, and you can potentially accumulate acid. Now, depending on the length of the rep and the amount of rest, it may not accumulate. Things like hill intervals are a good way of showing something that can be faster than lactic threshold, but because of the hill, because of the shortness of the reps, and because of the rest in between, it won't accumulate because of that. Because remember, acid is always being produced. Even you just sitting here watching this, you're producing acid. And this is what I was just getting into. It is very wrong to say that acid-producing system ever actually turns on, because it's always working. But when it's working harder for an extended period of time or with reduced rest, the acid can build. That's acid accumulation. So if I ever say acid being produced, I may actually be meaning to say acid accumulation, when you're basically noticing the acid in your muscles and it's causing fatigue. Mitochondria can clear acid using the electron transport chain. That's one of the big parts of aerobic respiration to produce ATP. Basically, the acid that is produced, the H+ ion that we'll talk about here in a second, the mitochondria use it, and you need that to produce aerobic energy. The idea that the anaerobic glycolytic system is always on, and it's helping to charge the aerobic energy system, and the aerobic energy system is kind of cleaning things up for the anaerobic glycolytic system. So when things are in balance, like anything in life, there's not a problem. It's when we start producing too much energy with anaerobic glycolysis that we produce acid, which is good for these workouts because we're trying to figure out ways that the body can deal with it. So the electron transport chain uses that acid, clearing the acid to produce ATP in aerobic respiration, but this is complex and slow process, so acid production usually outpaces it. It's easier to have that happen. You can't make your mitochondria work faster. You can produce more mitochondria with a lot of the aerobic work you did in general prep so that this can get pushed back, but you can't speed up the electron transport chain. It's just a very complex process. This is what causes the issue right here. So basically, we've got this idea that lactic acid sits in your muscles for about a quarter of a second, and then your body splits it right here at that red and white line. Your body moves the lactate, which is what the left side of this, the bigger molecule, becomes when it doesn't have this H+ ion on the end, and it moves this back to the liver, and it can reuse this for fuel later on, turns it into more glycogen that your body can store glucose. This is what causes the problem. This little free hydrogen ion drops the pH. So we usually measure lactate in the blood because it's so much bigger, but this is really what's causing the problem, but they come in a 1-to-1 ratio because your body makes this, splits it, and you have one lactate and one free hydrogen ion. So as the acid accumulates, as these little guys are first sitting in your muscles and then they can start being dumped into your blood, causing fatigue, the pH drops, causing acidosis, and fatigue due to reduced enzyme effectiveness and muscle pain. So as this drops the pH of your muscles and blood, your enzymes that produce energy, they don't work well when they're not right at neutral, and it also causes muscle pain. Your muscles do not like being exposed to acid. Again, that's called acidosis, when your body's pH drops below neutral or 7.0. If workouts are too intense, acid levels spike, causing mitochondrial damage and poor adaptation. So this is one of the questions we talked about, law of specificity, right? If we go out and we don't take sort of a mild approach, which starts with extensive tempo workouts earlier in specific prep. Again, there's a video in the description down below. But if we don't go from intensive tempo first and then get to Special Endurance 1 later on, then just dumping all this acid into your body, exposing all the mitochondria and everything else to it, it's going to cause poor adaptation and mitochondrial damage. So the idea is you got to ease into it so your body can handle the ever-increasing levels of acid throughout the weeks as it adapts to it. If you just go out the first week of specific prep, like, all right, we're going to go as fast as we possibly can until the kids just can't go anymore or you can't go anymore, you're just not going to adapt very well to that. You're going to damage a lot of mitochondria because we don't have the acid buffering capacity. And you're not going to adapt well. It's just not really a good idea. You have to kind of walk yourself through the process. And the idea of me linking intensive tempo and special endurance 1 is hopefully to illustrate that, as well as I would definitely watch the video on extensive tempo before attempting any of this. So just to continue to look at this idea of acid levels. So here is a chart that looks at the acid levels at various intensities. So as I mentioned, you just watching this presentation, or even if you're sleeping or whatever it is you're doing, you're always producing acid. Basically at rest is typically 0.8 to 1.8 millimoles of lactate in your blood. And this is going to be for an average trained person when we look at the actual race intensities here. Somebody who's never trained before, they're not going to be able to reach these levels at the faster intensity. But this is the idea, again, of your mitochondria need the H plus ions, the acid, to do their own electron transport chain, and you need that to be able to continue to produce ATP, for any period of time. So it's the idea of things being in ratio. Lactic threshold, the idea of this is the area where your body can produce. This is not acidosis, but just above this becomes acidosis. It's about 2.5. This can be improved by training, running at lactic threshold or just over it at critical velocity if you're someone that needs that type of training. Some people naturally can do it a little bit higher. They just have more of an aerobic capacity to push things back and that kind of thing. But this is what it is for most people. Anything above that for most people, and you're in acidosis. The 10K is at 7.5 millimoles of lactate. That's not only because it's above lactic threshold, but because it's a much longer race. The 5K is a much faster intensity than the 10K. So this is obviously because of the length, but it's more so because it's almost, twice as, intense, not twice as fast, but twice as intense as what the 10K would be to get this much higher in about half the amount of time. 3,200 meters, 3 millimoles of lactate more so than this is the idea that 5K and 3,200 meters are very closely associated. 3,200 meters is one of the best field tests for VO2 max. You start getting into 1,500 meters, this is what intensive tempo workouts typically get you to, is 15 millimoles of lactate. And then special endurance 1, close to 400 meter pace, will get you closer to 24 millimoles of lactate. So if we can safely get to these levels and be able to buffer these types of things as you get through the process, extensive tempo is going to be a little bit more so than 3,200 meters. That's VO2 max, aerobic power, and then get to this step and eventually get to this step down here. You can definitely deal with the acid levels of 9 millimoles of lactate as long as you do it in a safe way. You try and do this from the get-go and you dump all this acid into it, and you're just not going to like the result, both short-term and long-term. So our goal is to get them, either yourself, you're training yourself, the person you're training, or the team you're training, used to race-specific acidity levels so they can develop the specific ability to buffer this acid concentration, okay? So one thing it used to be kind of a term that was thrown around that really isn't true. No human can actually tolerate acid accumulation in the muscles. If you've got, like I said, 7.0, if you remember back from your chemistry class when you were a sophomore in high school, is 7.0. You drop that just a small amount, 6.98 or whatever, very small amount, your body does not like that. Enzymes stop working so well, mitochondria start to not like it, your muscles don't like it. No human being can tolerate acid, even a mild increase in acid, your body cannot actually tolerate it. Here is the analogy. You have your stove on, and you go and you put your hand on it. You are going to burn yourself. If you go back every day for a year and put your hand on that stove in the same way, you are still going to get burnt by that stovetop. In the same way that your muscles, the enzymes, everything inside you are going to be burnt, and I'm doing air quotes here, by the acid that's in there. It does not matter. Maybe, for a fraction of a second, if you get a huge callus or something on your hand, it won't do it, but you're still not really going to be tolerant to it. What we need to do is put something in between your hand and this. Well, really, you shouldn't be touching the stovetop, but if we're insistent, like those of us who are distance runners trying to get ready in the 5K, We need to put something in between our hand so that when we put our hand on the stovetop, it won't burn. That's what acid buffering agents that your body stores in the working muscles, and what some of the things are that can be produced in your blood. That's what we're really trying to do here with these workout types. We're trying to put something in between, or really to neutralize the acid, so that not that we can tolerate the acid, but so that we can buffer the acid. We can neutralize the acid. So that's really what we're dealing with here. So think about that. You're not, early on in the training, you're not, I'm not tolerant to the acid, and later on I am, in the same way that you can be more tolerant to heat or cold as you're exposed to it. That's not really what's going on here. Your body is putting something in between your cells, enzymes, all these different things, and the acid, so that it just doesn't get exposed to it, essentially. However, too much acid too fast, we talked about this in the previous slide, can damage mitochondria. Mitochondria do not like acid, which is very ironic considering the fact that they use it for electron transport chain. But if it just starts swimming in acid, it can damage and kill the mitochondria, and that can reduce aerobic energy production. So we need to slowly introduce this to them, as we talked about, by starting with extensive tempo, going to intensive tempo, and eventually special endurance 1. Intensive tempo special endurance 1 will expose the athlete to acid levels higher than what they'd experience at races in the cross-country 5K, as we said, so that they can definitely deal with this 9 millimoles of lactate for an extended period of time like they would be in the cross-country 5K. So how exactly, or why exactly, does the anaerobic glycolytic system improve? Like we just talked about, how do we get that ability for them to buffer the acid and different things? So basically, it's an increased acid buffering capacity, as I sort of alluded to. After exposure to acid, the body stores various products to neutralize it, reducing or delaying muscle fatigue. Reducing it early on in the race, and then delaying it to where they're spent at the end of the 5K, but they don't get, I'm walking across the finish line sort of look to them. This is sometimes called acid tolerance, as we talked about, but that isn't, really what's going on. We already talked about it. It's actually acid buffering capacity. So one of those things is just more hemoglobin, which comes with more blood. We actually did a lot of this in general prep, and then also your body can do different things to store more of this as you're actually going through the different training. Your body, the acid is produced in the working muscles, and as it gets too high, your muscles can dump the acid, which is actually also a training effect that we'll get to, into the blood. So if your blood can neutralize it, it's one pathway to neutralizing and buffering some of this acid. This is really the big one, more sodium bicarbonate. This is in the working muscles. There's actually other things, but sodium bicarbonate is probably the most well-known one. You take this if you have an upset stomach or acid reflux disease or heartburn. It neutralizes acid in the same way. It's a base type product. So if this is sitting in your working muscles, when the acid starts to accumulate in the actual muscles, this can help to neutralize a good amount of it before it gets too high and starts hurting or causing fatigue. And blood plasma proteins, just like with the hemoglobin, this can also help neutralize it. So these things collectively are what helped to acid buffering capacity for people that have been exposed to it in a safe way, not just going, from 0 to 100, but kind of progressing through it. Some other things, there is going to be increased muscle strength. If you're stronger, if your muscles can produce more energy, you can produce more energy anaerobic glycolytically with those muscle fibers that can produce energy faster without oxygen. You're going to have more anaerobic enzymes. You're producing more energy. Your body realizes, okay, this is a thing. I better have the ability to produce some more energy. You're going to get more anaerobic enzymes, so it's going to be working faster. Increase cell pores to remove acid. This is one of the things that I mentioned. So you've got certain muscle fibers, and I'll put this video in the description down below where I talk about muscle fiber types. Basically, you have some muscles that produce more acid, and as you do more training that spurs this acid production, these muscles have to figure out a way to remove the acid, and they can create these pores specifically designed to get acid and basically dump or pour the acid out of these muscles into the blood. Hopefully we've got this more hemoglobin, blood plasma, these different neutralizing products in the blood, so that when it does this, it can take care of it. And also the more aerobic type muscles, well, first off, hopefully the sodium bicarbonate does some of the job first, but when it can't do it, then it dumps it into the blood. And then actually aerobic muscles, slow twitch muscle fibers, have different pores that accept acid because they've got all those mitochondria that want to use it for electron transport chain, as well as some sodium bicarbonate in them. So it becomes a whole thing to where if you're really developing it, it can really reduce and delay the muscle fatigue as it dumps this acid into these areas. and into the blood, into the muscles that can actually use it for more aerobic type respiration. So it's kind of an intricate process that really does kind of feed into itself, especially if it's been trained in a balanced way. Also, an athlete gets older. An athlete that is on the younger end, and it's kind of different for different people, has less ability to buffer acid. A little bit of acid hurts younger athletes a lot more. So this is why at the middle school level, you really shouldn't do this type of training in any way. Even younger high school kids have a problem with this. Currently our best runner at Wharton High School, when he was a freshman and sophomore, would really get hurt by special endurance type training, and his energy or his body just hadn't matured physically to the point where he can deal with it. And now this runner can drop under 53 seconds in a 400 on purely aerobic type work, and really can handle these things as right at 2 flat before our season was cut short in the track season last year. So he just needed to develop physically so that he could be able to buffer it and withstand a little bit more of this acid, because a little bit of acid hurts younger athletes a lot more. So typically girls are going to develop a little bit more quickly on this. Guys might take until even say their junior year or maybe even longer before they get this. But as they get older throughout the training year, this is going to be something that's not training induced. That is also something that needs to be factored in. Adaptations, improving the anaerobic glycolytic system, are mostly biochemical in nature. Obviously this is not biochemical, but the idea of these different neutralizing products is biochemical in nature. Enzymes could be argued are structural, and they're not really biochemical, but they're not like making your heart bigger essentially. And these pores, these are structural in nature, but they're not like putting down pathways for your blood. So the idea being is a lot of these things take less time. We talked about earlier on the time frame. Why are we not doing this type of training in the summertime? It's because of this mere fact. These are biochemical in nature. It's about storing a lot of these different things. This requires less time, 9 to 11 weeks. The other interesting thing is these abilities, especially the sodium bicarbonate, which is probably the biggest part of this, stores. After about 13, 14 weeks, the stores of this go down. Like your body kind of goes into cycle. So if you start this too early, it's a very bad thing. The idea being is you don't want to peak in October if your state meet is in November. So the timing on this is pretty important too. We basically want the aerobic system to peak at the same time the anaerobic system peaks. So we've got all that 100% of energy contributions all firing on full cylinders at the most important meets. So we just talked about some of these designed adaptations, but just to sort of formalize the adaptations of intensive tempo and special endurance. 1, you want to continue the window for the peaking of the anaerobic glycolytic system. You started this with your extensive tempo workouts prior to getting to this point. As we said, you need 9 to 11 weeks to peak this cycle. You don't want to do too much too early so that it peaks too soon. But really, what most people do is they don't start this type of work soon enough in a cross-country season. If you think about it, 9 to 11 weeks is a pretty long time, and in most states, that's not that much longer than the first day of official practice. Here in Florida, our first day of official practice is July 27th, so we're not starting it then, but if I remember correctly, it's the second, that's actually more like the third week of August, something like that, when we started doing extensive tempo workouts. A lot of times people will wait to do this until the end of September or October, and then there's not enough time to get to this point. So you kind of have to play both sides. There's that idea of the Goldilocks effect, right? Just right is just right. You don't want to be too early to the dance, and you don't want to be too late. You want to be there just at the right time. So kind of make sure that makes sense for you. For the fictitious macro cycle we've been dealing with, we've been using November 7th as the ending period, because that's when the state meet is hopefully going to be here in Florida. So if yours is a little bit different than that, you're going to have to adjust when you start it, when we start looking at the fictitious macro cycle that I always do to kind of show where these workouts could kind of fit in. So just keep that in mind. You can obviously do it too early if you're doing these in July or especially June, but quite often a lot of times people don't start them soon enough too. The other adaptation, so the medium intensive tempo work transitions to more intense tempo work, right? So we continue the peaking window that we started, and it's transitions getting us to this more intense special endurance 1 work later on in the season. You're probably not even going to get to really truly intensive tempo by the end of specific prep, but you certainly will by pre-comp. It'll be starting to get close, and that's why I link these two together. Starting easier and progressing through these paces will prepare the athlete for faster paces later in the training year. and it's going to continue storing some of the acid buffering agents at a higher level. So the fact that you went through the tier process here, you started with easier extensive tempo, then went to intensive tempo, and then special 1, also special 2, which will be another video. You've developed and you've stored more of these acid buffering agents, so as you get higher and more intense, the workouts are more quality and you adapt to it properly. You've also done work like those short and medium hills, as well as alactic fly 30s, all through general prep, those specific strength type of runs. And you also did the extensive tempo, as I mentioned before. These are going to prep them for the faster running, what they did earlier in the year for what they're doing right now at this point in the training year. So the idea is that this is all very well thought out, right? You did short hill intervals and alactic runs all through general prep. You didn't get too far away from fast running, and you did it in a way that they're not accumulating acid, so we're not starting the clock. And then when we get to medium hills, you're also not developing acid. It's not accumulating, but it's getting closer to things like then eventually extensive tempo. You're still doing alactic fly 30s all the way through specific prep and maybe the start of pre-comp. Medium hills become long hills. I mean, all these different things. So it's very well kind of thought out to get to the point where you're eventually doing special endurance 1. So it's kind of this process along the way. Of course, you have the issue of kids that show up on the first day of official practice or the first week of school or whatever, and you kind of have to do your best to get them safely through as many of these steps as you can, but also getting them ready to peak at the right time. And then sometimes they're just not going to be able to do some of these workouts. So be careful with that, because obviously somebody who started training, the end of May, beginning of June is going to have much more adaptations, much more on them. They're much more prepared for this than somebody that shows up, at least here in Florida, the first day of official practice is July 27th. And the other thing that you're going to be doing is, this is the critical thing, this is really why you're doing it, is reduce or delay the acidosis fatigue in races. We want them to be totally fatigued after the finish line, right? That's the idea. We've got this acid buffering capacity so that they don't get super fatigued a half mile from the finish line or a mile from the finish line and they're just crawling across, or hopefully not going out at mile pace on the first mile and now they're dead for the next 2.1. So that's the idea of delaying reducing it and then delaying it until we want them to. And actually, if you do this 100% correctly, sometimes by the end of the season, you'll have high school runners, or if it's yourself running, this idea is like, wow, it just didn't feel nearly as bad and I went way, way faster. It's because they can neutralize this acid. They can delay the fatigue, reduce the fatigue, all these different things. So the ability to neutralize the acid in the working muscles and as it gets dumped into the blood, as we talked about, will keep pH closer to 7.0 for longer in the race. That way they are just that much better at the end. You want to try and reverse split these things if you can. Our best runner at Wharton High School right now is just fantastic of having that first mile just be very, very relaxed. There's one race that he did last year where he was something like 50th place at the mile and ended up finishing 6th. Just, reverse splitting, not getting too fatigued, not letting the acid get there. That's talking about good race strategy too, but also because, he's keeping the pH at a really solid level. So this, along with proper race strategy, like I said, you're not going out at mile pace on the first mile of your 5K because you're not going to like the results. No acid buffering capacity that you've done early on is going to help. Is going to help when you have really bad race strategy like that. So don't go out at mile pace on the first mile. But if you're doing it properly, you have a good race strategy along with this acid buffering capacity. It's going to allow for these very strong finishes. So this is a slide that I'm borrowing from my anaerobic workout pace summary that I'll have in the description down below, where this information comes from USA Track and Field Coaching Curriculum. It's all the anaerobic workout paces from speed or the anaerobic alactic down to the least intense extensive tempo. And as I mentioned in that one, a lot of times, especially in the track season, you're doing everything from speed endurance, which we're not talking about here. It's not important for a distance runner. Even in track, much less cross country, down to extensive tempo. We mentioned that it's got to be based on percentage of current best 400 meters, the same way that your 2 mile pace or your VVO2 max sets workout intensities for aerobic paces. But there is a variant for cross country that I'll get into in a second, but just to kind of take you through these. As we look at it, something like extensive tempo, video in the description down below, as I mentioned, is 75% 400 meter pace, or 74 to 76% if you're getting a range. So that's pretty easy in terms of intensity. That's not that fast in reality. This is what your sprint coach might call tempo 200s, tempo 400s. You can get a decent amount of work on this if you needed to, but that's the way you would do it there. Special Endurance 1 and intensive tempo are kind of up along this process. Special Endurance 2 is more intense than intensive tempo, but it's not as fast as Special 1, but it's also longer. And I'll do, again, a workout video on Special Endurance 2 and intensive tempo linked together in the next few days. But intensive tempo is 85%. So that's the idea of you do extensive tempo first, and then you get to this more medium type pace or mile workout type pace. So 85% 400 meters or 84 to 86% range. Intervals typically 350 to 500 meters. You can get a pretty decent amount of total work on this, and then you kind of do this first, and then you kind of creep up to Special Endurance 1, which is, like I said, right at 400 meter pace, 96 to 100%, but it's not for a full 400, it's 150 meters to 300 meters. So if you actually looked at all these, you'll realize that everything from 10 meters out to about 600 meters is covered in these anaerobic paces. The 800 is going to be more aerobic than anaerobic, so that's why you might train more aerobically when you get longer out, something like aerobic power, VO2 max interval, something like that. But that's the idea of the way this is all set up for track from USA Track and Field. So that's the way you would do this looking in a track season, 96 to 100% for Special Endurance 1, much more intense than this. The idea why you don't jump right into this because they're just not ready for it, and it's much less intensity, almost out to a mile if you were doing this. But as I said, variant for cross-country season. Let's see what that can mean, because, are we really doing 400 meter testing in cross-country, okay? Short answer is, you certainly could. You certainly could. The USATF cross-country specialization course really does say that's the way that you should be doing it, right? USATF has broken down the paces. We just looked at it. There's a whole video that talks about it in detail in the description down below as percentages of current best 400. So you could do a 400 meter test every 3 weeks, the same way you might do a VO2 max test every 3 weeks, or a race to reset VO2 max, because you're going to get more fit anaerobically and you're going to want to update this. This could be paired with something like a recovery run on the back end. You could do a good warm-up 400 meter test, get out of your spikes, and then get into your trainers. Hopefully you have a trail or something close to you to where they're not just running through your campus, but send them on a 5-mile run, a 6-mile run, a 45-minute recovery run, something that you would also do so you wouldn't do it. You could also pair it with something kind of close to lactic threshold. I've done it in the past in the track season, where I'll do something called critical velocity 400s. That's like 88 to 92% broken up as 400s. On those days, and even on lactic threshold, you're trying to get them able to get right at lactic threshold and then, be able to push that a little bit more so. So if they've got a decent amount of acid, as long as you give them a break in between this and some of these things, you could theoretically do that. Okay, you certainly could. There's nothing wrong with the science of doing that. However, I really do think that there's a better variant that you could use for cross-country. Now, again, this is not from USA Track and Field. USA Track and Field would say 400 meter tests every 3 weeks, just like your VO2 max test. Once you get to specific prep, you're not doing 400 meter testing in general prep because you're not doing anaerobic workouts, and go from there and pair it up with something else. But for me in my situation, the idea being is you kind of know the science, you know what's going on, you know your why for the day. I have a whole video about knowing your why. If you know those things, you can kind of figure out how can you get what you would want from intensive tempo and Special Endurance 1 for cross-country that can actually potentially even add to what you're trying to do in cross-country with things like pacing and that kind of thing. So basically what I do, you can just stop it right now and use the 400 meter percentage if you want. That's a way of doing it. It's a very good way of doing it, and you can get the job done also. But for what I've done, what works for my why and our situation at Wharton High School is involving giving them a target time. Not a goal time to hit it, but a time of how long I want you to run. Say 35 seconds. We'll get to that being what I actually like to use for Special Endurance 1 in a second here. So we're going to go 35 seconds, guys and gals, as hard as we can, and the intensity is going to be dictated by manipulating the rest, okay, to get the intensity I want. If I want the intensity to be at intensive tempo, it's going to be short rests, right? Because they're not going to be able to go 400 meter pace if I'm giving them short rest. If I want it to be Special Endurance 1 type intensity, now I'm going to give them a lot of rest. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. Early on in the season, tight rest, and it's going to expand out as they get more fit anaerobically, they get more buffering agents to deal with the acid, and then they can actually do it effectively, they can adapt to it properly, all the great things that we're looking for proper adaptation. So as I mentioned, for Special Endurance 1 and the early intensive tempo type workouts that are kind of simulating progressing to that, I usually do reps of 35 seconds. Why do I do 35 seconds? Most are going to go more than 200 meters in 35 seconds. High school boys are probably going to get to 200 meters in 35 seconds, and most of the girls are going to get pretty close to that too, if not be there. But very few are going to be able to get more than 300 meters, right? So the idea being is, of course, for intensive tempo, we could go out to 500 meters, but again, I'm sort of simulating, light version of Special Endurance 1 as I'm starting it with intensive tempo, so I really don't want them going further than 300 meters, right? And they're definitely not going to be able to with the rest I'm going to suggest here in a second. So when working intensive tempo, give tight rest and expand out to Special Endurance throughout the season, as I mentioned. So for intensive tempo, I give them a target that will keep the intensity low, starting at 2 to 3 minutes. Why are we dealing with 2 to 3 minutes? If you remember the video we talk about with alactic running, you will remember that alactic running needs 3 to 4 minutes to recharge 80% of the creatine phosphate that charges that speed, fastest energy recharging system. So if I give them 2 to 3 minutes, they're going to have to use the anaerobic glycolytic system to produce most of the energy. That's very deliberately chosen of 2 to 3 minutes, so that they might get some of the alactic system recharged, but not a lot. So I want them working anaerobic glycolytic. My why for the day on this is I'm working anaerobic glycolytic fitness so that they can produce more acid buffering agents. If I gave them 4 minutes on this early on, they're going to get the alactic system. I'm not going to get them to kind of step through the process early on. I need them to be exposed to the acid early on at a moderate intensity because of the tight rest, so that later on they can go faster because they've been able to buffer more of the acid. As you progress, maybe the second time you do it, give them 3 to 4 minutes. And then the third time, maybe 5 to 6. Something like that. That's typically the way I progress through it. As they get more fit anaerobically. This will probably take you to about the end of specific prep, 5 to 6 minutes. So this is not really Special Endurance 1, but I think you can see why I link these two together. As you get to where you're actually working Special Endurance 1, more in the pre-comp phase, rest is going to be extensive. 7 to 10 minutes. The last time we typically do this in the season might be 10 to 12 minutes. You need to go fast to get the intensity up, and to go fast, to have that high intensity, to have that high lactic response so that you can buffer it at the end of the race when you need to. You have to give them a lot of rest. Okay, I know especially a lot of times distance coaches want to cut that rest, tight rest. We're distance runners, we don't have a lot of rest. If you want them to run fast, you have to give them a lot of rest, and that's where you're going to get them to really more in pre-comp. But again, you can see why I'm linking this together. So it's really just not about the idea of it. And again, you can do it this way. There is nothing wrong with doing it this way. I just find this to be better for a distance kid, to say 35 seconds, guys and gals, and I'm giving you 2 to 3 minutes, and I'll kind of show you the design here. But basically, I want these to all be very consistent as you're going through. So modify yourself as you're going through. What does that sound like? What are you doing in cross country? You're modifying your pacing. You're realizing where your limits are, feeling where your limits are with the difference of terrain and different things. Sure, you can have a GPS watch, but 5:15 pace on one course is very different than 5:15 pace on another course. So you have to kind of feel what your body's feeling, and that's why I really like this for cross country, is it gets them used to feeling the pace, knowing what they're capable of as they're going through, and it's really translatable, I think, to a race, especially the end of the race when they're going to be feeling that acid really start to grab them, and hopefully they're going to be able to, get to that point. So all right, so I will break these up in terms of training design just because of the slight caveat there of the difference, and I don't want to get confusing on the actual rest, but basically there's going to be 1 per microcycle of intensive tempo in early specific prep and throughout kind of as needed as you're kind of going through, depending on how many intensive tempo type ones you want, but till you get to the specific prep. So that's going to be kind of based on you and your situation. Like I said, probably you won't get to really Special Endurance 1 until you're actually clear of specific prep, but you'll be getting close. So that's kind of the idea of when these transition from intensive tempo to actually Special Endurance 1 really doesn't matter as long as you're kind of progressing through. Specific prep microcycles are typically about 9 days, so you're probably going to do these, every 9 days. So usually you're going to get one about every other week, depending on how it actually works out with your situation, and also kind of fitting in things like races and that kind of thing. These should be done definitely as intervals because of the intensity being low. Intervals meaning incomplete recovery. It's going to allow for larger amount of this, fairly high intensity work. It's more high intensity than, say, in a recovery run or something like that. But it's going to be incomplete recovery. That's what interval means. When you get to Special Endurance 1, it's going to be closer to complete recovery, and that's what's going to kind of change not only the design of the workout, but the actual adaptations you're getting from it. You definitely want to try and do these on a track spiked up if you can. Obviously some high schools don't have a track. Some high schools only have, hard surface tracks. We're fortunate enough at Wharton High School that we do have a rubber track that we can use so we can spike them up and do that. So you do want to go quite fast if you can. If you don't have that, you want to do it on the fastest surface possible. Probably not the day to try and do this on grass. I'll show you in Special Endurance 1 why there's a really good reason why you would try and do it on grass, but you want to try and do this on a fast surface if you can, a road, an abandoned road or something like that. If you've got like a shell road park or something like that, or a hard top surface at a park, something like that. If you can't use a track, I always do them at the track, spiked up, because we want to go quite fast on these days, or as fast as you're allowing them to go with the rest. Rest is going to be short to start. Okay, so as we said, first time, give them about 2 to 3 minutes is how I do it. If you're doing it with my mentality, if you're doing it with the 400 meter, predictor, or not 400 predictor, 400 meter percentage of it, you do it slightly differently. This is based on, like I said, expanding out the rest. So 2 to 3 minutes, so as I said, you don't get the alactic system being fully recharged, so they're going to have to be exposed to that acid. That's what we want here. The extent, I would say typically, like I said, between 150 and 300 meters. When I'm doing intensive tempo to transition to Special 1, you can do intensive tempo to get to Special Endurance 2 also, but when I'm doing it this way, tracked up on the spiked up on the track, the extent I would give is 150 to 300 meters. When we get into Special Endurance 1 progression, or 2 progressions, this will be expanded out to more like 400 meters. But again, I don't really give it as meters. As I said, I give it as 35 seconds, because that puts the whole group kind of in that window. Total volume of about 1 to 2 miles as you're doing it. Typically we'll do like, 5 to 6 reps, something like that, depending on how they're holding up. The intensity is going to be moderate due to the rest. Okay, the rest being very tight at the beginning. As I said, if you're doing it the way that I'm suggesting here, is I don't give them paces, I just give them time, and I tell them to go as fast as possible while staying consistent for the rep. Okay, again, it teaches paces. Using markers here. So one thing that we do, and you can probably find a better way than doing this, but what we've done is we've got kind of like these sticks that we use to rope off our track when we're hosting track meets and things like that, and we just put those all down right around the 250 meters from the starting line. Put enough for every single person, and then I have them either bring an extra shirt or something like that. Sometimes they use a shirt, as you saw in the actual reps, and on the first rep they're carrying whatever they're going to use as the actual like cloth marker or something. Like it could be a cloth, it could be like I said, a shirt or something like that. And on the first rep they run with it, and when I say stop at 35 seconds, they just drop their shirt or they drop the marker, whatever it is that they're using, the cloth marker, and that's their mark for the next one. They go and quickly grab one of those sticks, put it where they actually drop their shirt or cloth or whatever, and then they mark it with theirs, so they know what they got to on the first one. And then I tell them, all right, get to that marker every single time. So you're already kind of teaching them pacing on the first one. We're not doing our 400 meter PR or our 200 meter PR or whatever. It's got to be something that is relatively fast, but you got to be able to do it every single time. So as they get used to pacing themselves, the first time it's going to be all over the place. They probably are going to go too fast on the first one and have a hard time getting back to it every single time. But the more experienced ones, as they do this more, they're going to get pretty decent at this as they're going through, So I think that's kind of, again, a good thing to kind of teach them pacing. Very rarely do I see a kid that goes out and then they smoke their first marker every single time, although those really smart analytical ones might do that. But usually you don't see that quite as often. So that's how I do it with the markers, and helps, again, teach them some pacing. Recovery should be active. So on the first one, they stick their stake in the ground, they put their marker on top, and then you start doing your active recovery. Easy jog. Easy aerobic work allows for the acid levels to stay moderate, which is what we want. We want it to accumulate, but to stay fairly moderate and actually enhance some aerobic growth. It basically becomes a continuous workout because they jog to the line, and then they hit the next one, and they hit the next one, they hit the next one until they get to 5 to 6. They change out their spikes, and then they go on their cool down. So that's the way it works for intensive tempo design. Medium intensity but tight rest will mean acid will accumulate as this workout goes on. This, plus them not having strong buffering agents built up yet, means this workout is going to hurt. It's going to hurt a lot, despite medium intensity. In fact, this workout's going to hurt a whole lot more than ones they're going to be doing in a few weeks. Why? Because of that idea is they don't have the strong acid buffering agents. So they're going to be going faster later on, and it's going to hurt them less, which is what we really want. So it's medium intensity, but man, this just, mentally prepare them for this. It's going to hurt on this day, the first time that you do it. When you return to this later with expanded rest as they go out and better buffering capacity, it will hurt much less, but the reps will be much, much faster and more consistent. Now, during the cross-country season, what I would love to do is I would love to leave those stakes that I mentioned that I use as markers all the way through, and then they can kind of see on the second time through when they drop it how much further they got than the last time. Now, those stakes are kind of a danger because obviously our football team, I don't want them, running into the stakes or something like that. If there was a way I could do that, maybe mark the track or something like that. Still kind of figuring out how maybe I could do that. I've only done this the time variant over the last year as I was doing this. But I'd like to kind of see how they can kind of track it as they get better at buffering the acid. Obviously, the rest is going to let them go a little bit faster and everything too, so they can even track their growth. So, if you're watching this and you have a good idea on how to do it, please put it in the comments down below. I love the way to kind of track this all the way throughout, but I can't leave those stakes all the way through. It's just dangerous for the football team if they ran through the end zone and ran into one of those things. So, if you have an idea, please put it in the comments down below. I would love to see some great ideas on that. All right, so you can probably see this where it's going, but the training design for Special Endurance 1 training is very similar up top, 1 per microcycle. You would not do a Special Endurance 1 and an intensive tempo in the same week, not really. Even when you're totally anaerobically fit, you wouldn't be doing this. And it's possibly going to be by the end of specific prep, as I said, but you may not really even get to it until pre-comp, not really. 6, maybe 7 minutes, you're getting close to Special Endurance 1, truly. But that's just kind of the idea, is you might get there by the very, very end of specific prep, but probably more like pre-comp for most people. As I said in the last slide, specific prep, microcycles tend to be longer, 9-ish days. The reason for that, by the way, is simply because you have more things to do. You pretty much have everything you were doing in general prep, but now you're adding the anaerobic training. I will do a video on how to plan out your 9-day microcycles for how I've done it myself. It's usually a 2-step process for me, just so you can kind of see to make sure that you're giving your group or yourself everything that you need to be successful as you change the training phases. At this point, if it's in specific prep, it would be done as intervals, right? If you did get to it by the end of specific prep. In pre-comp, and definitely by the competition phase, if you were doing this, it would be in repetitions. Again, full recovery, your 10 minutes, 12 minutes, that kind of thing. Even at 6 to 7 minutes, that is not going to be complete recovery. You're not going to clear all the acid. So at this point, this type of training at this point of year is still going to be basically as intervals. It's going to be more rest than what you did with intensive tempo, but it's still not complete recovery. Repetitions are characterized by complete recovery. Intervals are characterized by incomplete recovery. Allow for larger amounts of high-intensity work. Again, just like before, nothing different here. Down on the track, spiked up. The arrest is going to start to become extensive. By the end, I give them 10 minutes. Really, you're probably going to be more like 6 to 7 in specific prep. And if you do get out to 10 minutes, well, now you actually are working intervals. These are going to ensure that they're very fast by the time you get to 10 minutes on the full rest. The rest is going to make it more intense, and because you've done these steps along the way, starting in general prep with those other workouts we were talking about, the hills, the alactic, and all that stuff, and now going through extensive tempo, intensive tempo, and now you're at Special Endurance 1, they're not going to be injured by it or anything like that. They're going to be well prepared for it. They will have benefit of the alactic system in this, so it's going to also make them faster, plus the acid buffering capacity built up, so this is one of the reasons why a couple of the reasons why they're going to be much faster. Extent is usually, again, 150 to 300 meters. I give that 35 seconds. Do however you want to do it. If you want to do the 150 to 300 with the 400 percentage, you certainly can. Total volume still is going to be about 1 to 2 miles. Typically more like 1 mile, really. I still usually give about 5 to 6, so I'm probably pushing that more like 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles, really. But I think that for the way that you do this with a cross-country season with the 35 seconds, things like that, I think you can get out to 6 of these and be perfectly safe. Intensity is hard due to the rest. Don't give actual paces like before. And go back to that. A lot of times people will say, wait, isn't it more intense because you're giving them less rest? Absolutely not. It's going to be more intense, and it's going to be much harder. They're going to develop more acid because of the rest. So kind of keep that in mind. but this is actually going to probably hurt way less because of what we talked about at the end of the last slide. I tell them again to go as fast as possible while staying consistent in the rep. Okay, teaches them pacing, using those markers as you go through. Recovery should be active just like before. Easy aerobic work allows for the acid levels to stay moderate and actually enhance aerobic growth. So here's sort of the difference here. Hard intensity and extensive rest will mean acid will be quite high. So wait, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Should the acid be cleared? Well, it's not going to fully clear. Even in 10 minutes, there's still going to be a little bit more. So you're going to be at a higher than lactic threshold. So you're going to be in acidosis if you're doing, say, 6 of these. So if you're doing 6 of these with, let's say, I don't know, 8 minutes in between. 6 of these, that means you're going to have 5 rest cycles, right? Because you're not resting between the last one. So 5 times, let's say, 6 minutes, you're at 30 minutes right there just on the rest. Plus you've got, the 30 seconds for the reps, so you're going to get to about 32, 33 minutes, something like that. That's 32, 33 minutes of elevated acid level, okay? Because it's not going to fully go away. They're going to be in acidosis for more than a half hour. Double what, a little bit more, a little bit less than a lot of people are going to be for their actual race in terms of double. So the idea being is they're going to be well prepared for the actual race themselves as they're going through. Now that acid level is going to ebb and flow, obviously. It's going to be highest right at the beginning of their rest interval, but it's still going to be above it, so they're going to be getting this acid buffering capacity for a very long period of time. So, however, the additional acid buffering capacity they've developed throughout the season in these and other workouts means they will be very fast and consistent. Again, you're going to see a lot more consistency as you do this throughout the season. And the thing that's really interesting, you will probably find they are hurt far less in these than they were in the early workouts. That first time, the pain is going to be there. It's going to really hurt the first time, probably the second time. The last couple times, at least the experience that I always have, is the kids are kind of walking around afterwards and they're okay. I mean, they feel like they did something, but they have much higher acid levels in those later season workouts than they did in those early season workouts. What's the difference? Acid buffering capacity. What we talked about early on. They've got the oven mitt on now. They're not being burnt by, the metaphorical stove as we talked about at the beginning of this presentation. All right, so here's the same fictitious macro cycle we've been dealing with as we did the general prep workouts and now specific prep. You see November on here. Again, I want to show you that whole idea of 9 to 11 weeks, and then you can hold the anaerobic peak for about another couple weeks after that, 2 to 3 weeks maybe maximum. So just to kind of give you an idea of where this would lie, we've got this idea of, in the state of Florida at least, our state meet is scheduled for the 7th of November. If you're dealing with a state that has a state meet on the 14th, or maybe you've got a different peaking place you want to be, you're going to need to adjust this a little bit, but just so you can kind of see that whole 9 to 11 plus, say, plus 2. If we've got 3 weeks for pre-comp, so we've got 1 week here in November, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, say 6 here, going from October to September to October, so that's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10th week here that crosses over between August and September, 12, 12, and then possibly a 13th here. We're just kind of getting it a little bit going on here with extensive tempo. So that's the idea of we've got the 9 to 11 weeks plus a couple. So if I usually schedule 3 weeks for pre-comp, 4 weeks for 3 weeks for comp, 4 weeks for pre-comp, and 5 weeks for specific prep, that's 12 weeks. You might want to do 13 depending on how you want to do it, but that's how I came up with this idea of specific prep starting here on the 16th of August if all things go according to plan. There's a couple of reasons why I also did that. I've got a video on just the specific prep planning in the description down below if you'd like a closer look. And so as we start, we end general prep here in the 2nd week of August, and we start it in the 3rd week of August. You'll see that we do not have intensive tempo / special endurance 1 until the 2nd week. You want to give them a little something first. The idea of extensive tempo workout being here. There's another one here. You're not going from 0 to 100. You're easing them into it. And then these medium hills, as I mentioned, I've got a video also in the description, also transitions to this type of work. So first week of specific prep, don't do this yet. They're not quite there yet. Give them something. You also typically are going to start racing, and that's also going to get the acid level to obviously a race-specific level because they are racing. And then we come down here in the 2nd week of specific prep, and we've got our first one, intensive tempo / special endurance 1 times 5 to 6, 35 seconds with 2 to 3 minutes rest. As I said, that first one, make the rest tight. About 3 miles on the back end. We'll talk about that a little bit more. About 6 mile day. Another extensive tempo workout a little bit later on in that week. And then as we get to September, This week, you'll see there's not one. Probably going to have Special Endurance 1 in here when we get to our Special Endurance 2 / Intensive Tempo somewhere in this week as they get into it. But the 4th week of specific prep, they're going to get their second 35-second Intensive Tempo Special Endurance 1 type workout. Another times 5 to 6. 35 seconds. This time I'm going to give them about 5 to 6 minutes. Special Endurance 2, as we got into here, probably gave them about maybe 3 to 4 minutes on that one. So again, the idea is it's kind of leading through it because we're still doing anaerobic glycolytic training. Special Endurance 1, Special Endurance 2, or really Intensive Tempo at this point is training the same system. It's just slightly different, right? You want it to be a little bit faster and more intense with Special 1 type work. Special Endurance 2 is going to be a little bit longer, a little more sustained. There's also a good reason why you could do it in a park in grass also that we'll get to when we get to that video, but that's where we've gotten to at this point. 3 miles, 25 minutes. So if I did it by my rule, I have not really gotten to true Special Endurance 1. The first time we would do that type of work, which would be about 7 to 8 minutes, would be here in pre-comp, which is what I kind of said would be the way we would be doing it. I do prioritize Special Endurance 2 a little bit more than Special Endurance 1 for a couple of reasons. One, again, it's about pacing and things like that, and we'll get to it. But also, there's a strength benefit that you can get from Special Endurance 2 that's a little bit more specific for the cross-country 5K, which is why you see about 3 of the weeks are going to be devoted to that in specific prep versus only 2 are going to get Special Endurance 1 / Intensive Tempo type work. So, see how that kind of works. You can adjust it how it works for you. That's what kind of works for me in my situation. But let's go ahead and get back to the presentation and finish this up. All right, so let's look at what this pair is great with and what this pair is terribly with, and then we will wrap some things up with some key points before we close out this presentation. These types of workouts pair great with an added cool down. Going 2 to 3 miles, I like 3, just because you get over 20 minutes, and that's the idea of 20 continuous minutes essential VO2 max development. But going 2 to 3 miles on the back end at an easy pace, heart rate about 120 to 150, not based on their normal recovery run pace. Immediately after, we'll add to their overall aerobic development. We typically get 6 to 7 miles, depending on how much you're actually doing, how quickly they're going on their easy active recovery in between. We're starting to prime the anaerobic glycolytic system with this, with Intensive Tempo 2, Intensive Tempo, and then a Special Endurance 1. As we get to that point, we're going to really be priming it. But aerobic system is still king, so whenever we can get a little bit of extra aerobic development on the back end is great. This is also going to remove the acid. This is the primary reason why you do a cool down. It's going to remove the acid that has accumulated, and it definitely will accumulate in these workouts, especially as the rest stretches out. Reducing soreness the next day while reducing mitochondria exposure to acid. We talked about mitochondria need the acid for electron transport chain to happen, but you don't want them to be swimming in it. So doing this right afterwards gets that cleared, so any potential damage to the aerobic capacity is minimized. I really like relaxation techniques, especially on high-intensity days like this. I've shown this in the past. After your cool down and after your stretching, you brought the body temperature down. Just 5 to 10 minutes. Find a place where you can just have either yourself or whoever you're training prop their legs up. It's great on a bench because when you do it on a bench and you just kind of have your calves sitting on where people would normally, sit, you use like no muscle energy at all, and you can just completely relax. If you have to put your feet like up on a fence or a wall or something like that, that's good. It helps get the blood from keep the blood from pooling in your extremities, but you are using a little bit of muscle energy, and I just like the idea of just being totally in a situation where you're using no muscle energy, just letting them relax. 5 to 10 minutes, legs up, eyes closed, just relax. It helps bring the heart rate down. As I said, it helps the blood from pooling at the extremities. It kind of helps speed up the recovery process and just brings them back down to baseline. And you can also ice on these days. There's some benefit to icing after a day like this, especially. The idea of icing is it actually constricts your blood vessels when you're in the ice to kind of reduce heat loss, and as soon as you get out, those blood vessels open up, more so, and it's like more recovery in a short period of time. And it helps clear that acid, clear some inflammation, get rid of those waste products and things like that. That's the idea of icing. The same reason why going on a cool down for 2 to 3 miles afterwards immediately is going to help reduce overall soreness. So if you wanted to ice, it would be on these days. I will say personally, I haven't had my group ice to get, in 2 years. If you do the added cool down, it's not really giving you much extra, but the cool down gives you the extra aerobic work, right? So that's why I choose to do that. You can do the extra 2 to 3 miles in the back end at about 25 minutes, and then you've got to fill up the ice baths, get the ice going in there, have them ice a couple at a time, and it adds another 45 minutes to your day and their day if they're the ones at the end. I don't see it being enough benefit, so I only do it if a kid absolutely says, I think it's going to help me get refreshed or something like that. But definitely I would say this is the order of importance that you would definitely want to do these things. What does it pair terribly with? Please, 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 please do not do your strength lifting days on these types of days, or at least afterwards. You could do it beforehand, early in the day. Say, maybe your school gym opens up at 6 or 6:30 for the football team or something like that, or they can go to their local gym or something like that beforehand, or maybe you want to open up the gym for them at your school too. That's perfectly fine as long as they have 6 or 8 hours or something in between. Don't do it afterwards. You won't get what you want from these lifts or the strength work. What's the point? They're super fatigued. These days are going to hurt. They are not going to have the strength capacity to do anything. You could do some plyometric work before to help prime them in the workouts. I don't really do it on Special Endurance 1, Special Endurance 2, Intensive Tempo. You notice on the Extensive Tempo I do the bounding circuit, and I definitely do them on hill days, but I really want the focus to be on the glycolytic training on these days. Plyometrics is something different. Plyometrics is really, elastic strength, what you're doing on your fly 30s and your hill days and things like that. You certainly could. There'd be nothing necessarily wrong with it. I just really want the focus on this day, and it's something I really like to do with high school kids, and definitely if you're more of a college coach and things like that, you're going to have you're not getting ready for the 5K, so you're going to change a lot of this anyway, but you can, I think, mix things a lot more with a college athlete or a professional or semi-professional athlete. High school kids, which is, who I coach, you kind of have to segment it. We're working on this today. They're just not trained enough to be able to mix things. It's why I don't really like doing things like ladder workouts and things like that. You're really super advanced kids, maybe at the end of the season when you're dealing with, especially in the track season, just the ones that made to the regional meet and then the state meet, you can get away with things like that. But for your vast majority, for your herd, I don't think it's the best thing to do, but you certainly could if you thought that there was benefit for it. And if you know your why and if it fits in with your why for the day, you could do it, and there's some good with doing plyometrics before, so this really shouldn't be in the pairs terribly. It's lifting, that kind of thing. Going into the weight room, doing actual lifting and things like that, it just doesn't work on these days. You're not going to get anything out of it, and if you start planning this all the time, because you think, speed and strength and all those types of things, you're going to eventually lose strength because they're not going to be lifting at a capacity that is going to be doing them much good. So just keep that in mind when you're planning this and knowing your why for the day. So let's go ahead and wrap this up with a few key points. Intensive Tempo and Special Endurance 1 workouts continue the process, right? This includes continuing the clock on the peaking window. We started it with Extensive Tempo the week before, 9 to 11 weeks by creating acid accumulation in a safe way early in specific prep, starting with intensive tempo intensity, either with targets or manipulating rest. However you do it, targets meaning based on targets of a 400 meter, or as I'm suggesting, manipulating rest, will allow them to safely progress into more intense work later on. Special Endurance 1 comes after as they are ready for hard anaerobic work. So again, it's just continuing that process that you started, continuing it. It keeps moving the chains to really true Special Endurance work and Special Endurance 1 work that you're going to be doing in pre-comp. Rest should be tight and progress out, target 2 to 3 minutes. And again, it's going to continue and progress out for Intensive Tempo and expand this each week until you are ready for true Special Endurance 1 work, where the rest will be out to 10 plus minutes. This type of work is best on the track that, 150 to 300 meter work. We need them to be fast on these days, so use the fast track surface and use spikes if they have them. Put the spikes in, go ahead and do it. As long as your track's in good shape and you're not worried about it breaking down throughout the season, spike them up, go out. They need to be going relatively fast on these days, and especially when you get to Special Endurance 1, they have to be going fast on these days. And last point, end with a good cool down routine. These are hard days. Like I said, the first couple times you do it, they are going to be very, very sore. In the end, this is not naturally what distance runners are good at, right? This type of high intensity lactic acid producing work. You need a good cool down to recenter them, to get them back into that aerobic type range that they're with, what makes them great. And you don't want them to hurt their aerobic capacity by having so much acid development, and a good cool down routine is going to help bring them back down to center, get them back to getting rid of some of these things that could potentially hurt them aerobically. So going 2 to 3 miles at the end, stretching, using some relaxation techniques can help bring back to baseline after these acid accumulation days, especially the first ones. And again, you could also ice them these days if you thought that it would be good for you and your situation. So if you like this video, please think about liking or subscribing. As I mentioned, I'll do a video that does intensive tempo to special endurance 2 in the next few days, and then a video on how to do your 9-day microcycles here in specific prep, and we'll kind of fill out the whole specific prep plan also as I fill in with some of those workouts that we were doing in general prep. So if you like this video, again, please think about liking or subscribing or maybe sharing it around. And until next time, this has been Coachy TV.